in recent years, in recent decades, we have observed many economies grow fast without experiencing a process of significant process of industrialization. And India is the typical example. So if we look at this picture, you can see the employment share in four major sectors of the economy: agriculture, services, manufacturing, and construction. And so you see the typical path that also China underwent, the decline in agriculture, the urbanization. But this urbanization is essentially entirely explained by an increase in the service sector, and also in the case of India by construction, and very little by an expansion of manufacturing activity. Another interesting observation here, we can see if we break down Indian districts in 1987 and in 2001 by quintile of urbanization. So the first quintile will be the most rural districts, and the second and the fifth quintile will be the most urban districts. And we see, then we can make visually a comparison between the 87 and the corresponding figure in 2011. Everywhere we have a decline in agriculture, and everywhere we have an increase in this category. We call it consumer services because we have tried to make a distinction between services that are mostly provided to firms and that they are tradable. For instance, IT or corporate law services, and traditional consumer services like the one I mentioned before. Retail, again, health traditional is probably the wrong word, but certainly local in nature. So restaurants. We think that to understand this, we need to take seriously the presence of large income effect, because different consumers are going to consume different type of goods, and we see it in the data. But let me start from the simplest model, where preferences are homothetic, which is what we often assume in macroeconomics, and what we don't assume here. So if we were to accept that preferences are homothetic, and we could know what type of parameterization of preferences we are, well, suppose that we want to infer the change in the price of consumer services at the local level, and we don't have that information. But suppose that we have information about the expenditure shares. That's an easier one to measure.
So today we have a very interesting webinar in which we have invited Professor Fabrizio Zillibotti, who is the Tuntex Professor of International and Development Economics in the Department of Economics at Yale University. He did his PhD of Economics from London School of Economics, and he holds an honorary Masters of Arts degree from Yale University as well. He is a former professor at University of Pompeo Fabra University College London, Stockholm, and the University of Zurich and Stockholm University. He's also a fellow of Econometric Society, European Economic Association, CEPR, CSIFO, and he's also the president of the European Economic Association back in 2016. He is the recipient of several grants and awards, out of which one is the Johnson 2009 award, which actually is given to researchers, especially recognizing them for their work below the age of 45. So that shows his research. And then the Sun Yifang 2012 award, then the Golden Cherry Prize reserved to the distinguished personalities in cultural, industrial, sports, and humanitarian fields from Emilia Romagna, such as Enzo Ferrari and Luciano Pavarotti. He has served in several editorial positions, including co-editor of Econometrica from 2016 to 19, chief editor of the Journal of European Economic Association 2009 to 14, and the director and managing editor of Review of Economic Studies from 2002 to 2006. His research interests include macroeconomics, economic growth and development, family economics, and economic development of China. He has published articles in many international journals, among them American Economic Review, Econometrica, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and Review of Economic Studies. He is an Italian citizen hailing from the town of Modena. He is married to Maria and father of a lovely daughter, Nora. So, with this brief introduction, now I would like to request Professor to please give his thoughts on the topic, which is very close to our heart because uh, whenever we talk about Pakistan, it's always looking for options for economic growth. So, this time we are going to hear from you on the topic of the unequal effects of service led growth. So, over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for the invitation, of course. So this is a joint work with Michael Peters, who is a colleague, and Tianyu Fan, who is a graduate student at Yale University. It's my first study on South Asia. I've done most of my earlier research, as you mentioned, on China and East Asia. And then, like many economists, I had this idea that to study economic growth and successful episode of takeoffs, we need to understand industrialization. So industrialization was typical mode through which economies went from the stage of being poor to becoming rich that has been experienced by most Western economies and also by China, for instance, or other East Asian economies. Except that in recent years, in recent decades, we have observed many economies grow fast without experiencing a significant process of industrialization. And India is the typical example. So if we look at this picture, you can see the employment share in four major sectors of the economy: agriculture, services, manufacturing, and construction. And so you see the typical path that also China underwent, the decline in agriculture, the urbanization. But this urbanization is essentially entirely explained by an increase in the service sector, and also in the case of India by construction, and very little by an expansion of manufacturing activity. I also took a look at Pakistan, a country I know much less about, I must say. But, well, the picture is less extreme in the case of India, in the sense that the structural change out of agriculture was a little slower, partly because initially the share of agriculture in this period was already lower in Pakistan than in India. But again, in qualitative terms, it looks similar to India. So it was mostly an increase of the service economy. There was also some increase in manufacturing sector. Again, here we're talking about employment share, but it is less pronounced. In fact, this pattern is not specific to South Asian economies. If we take all economies that below the development stage of China, that was completely arbitrary choice, of course, and we plot the change in employment share of agriculture on the left against the change in the service employment share on the right against the change in manufacturing employment share. So, most of the developing economies experience a significant decline in the agricultural employment share. The interesting question for us is where does this go? And if you can see already visually, this is the average between 1991 and 2019. There is a much steeper relationship with employment share in services on the left than on manufacturing. So on average, for every 10 percentage point decline of employment in agriculture, 7 percentage points go to services and about 2 go to manufacturing, and the rest goes to other other sectors like utilities or construction. So, and you can see here actually India and Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan, as our previous picture showed, is a little above the regression line. It means that it features little more industrialization than the average country at the same stage of structural transformation, but it's not significantly far away. And this relation is very tight. So it seems that, though there are some outliers here and there, this is a very, very clear pattern that we observe. Now, this contrasts quite starkly with the process of structural transformation that today's industrialized or post-industrial nations underwent. Here you can see a sample of them from some European nation, Japan, UK, and US. Now, to understand this graph, on the horizontal, we have the GDP per capita in PVP terms. So these nations have reached that level of GDP at different point in time. So it's not a strictly speaking a time series. But what you can see is that the percentage of labor force employed in the industrial sector went up much more steep than in today's developing nations. And in fact, at the peak, so you see this hump shape. So the typical pattern is first industrialization and then what we call sometimes tertiarization, so movement towards services, and that can be quite fast too. But at the peak, many of these countries had a share of manufacturing of the order of 35 to 40%, for the UK even more. So this is the past, of course, and it seems like the current picture is different. You can see also China here. Now, there can be a number of reasons, but it's an interesting pattern. Let me then narrow down the focus on India, because this is the country we studied. And in particular, most of my comparison would be between 2 years, 1987 and 2011. Historically, we started using the microdata from those 2 years. So the study focused on that period. And here what you can see is how the employment share varies across different service industries. So service is a very heterogeneous category. So you might think, well, the economy has gone more into services because we have a lot of IT services these days, which is certainly important for the Indian economy. You see the second set of bars, but it is dwarfed by rather traditional services like retail, leisure. Well, health is probably not necessarily traditional, but certainly it's a local service. So most of this boom between 1987 and 2011, here is broken down between rural and urban district in India, happens in services that are non-tradable, and a significant part of those is one would call them traditional. So that's the bulk of the expansion here. Another interesting observation here, we can see if we break down Indian districts in 1987 and in 2001 by quintile of urbanization. So the first quintile will be the most rural districts, and the second and the fifth quintile will be the most urban districts. And we see, then we can make visually a comparison between the 87 and the corresponding figure in 2011. Everywhere we have a decline in agriculture, and everywhere we have an increase in this category. We call it consumer services because we have tried to make a distinction between services that are mostly provided to firms and that they are tradable. For instance, IT or corporate law services, and traditional consumer services like the one I mentioned before, retail, health, etc. Again, health traditionally is probably the wrong word, but certainly local in nature. So restaurants and others. So you can see that there is a complete transformation when we go to the fifth quintile. So in the fifth quintile, we're really a boom of these activities in terms of the share of income and share of employment. relative to what happened in other parts of the country where the transition was less dramatic. Okay, so I want to draw your attention on this fact that this boom, this qualitative transformation is particularly accentuated in the fifth quintile. So, summary of this evidence: services appear to play a large and growing role in India and also in other developing countries. And there are two views about that. The first one, which comes to the tradition of growth and development economics, Daniel Roderick, for instance, has been vocal about that recently, is that we should worry about that because, well, the expansion of the service sector cannot grant the sufficient dynamism in terms of productivity growth. In fact, according to this view, the engine of growth is industrialization and improvement in productivity in industry. That generates some income effects. People become richer and then increase the demand of services. But the demand of services is almost like corollary of economic development. It's not the cause of economic development. Well, today's talk is going to question and challenge the view because the fact that there is no productivity growth in service activity is something that is not really proven or borne out in the data, partly because, as I will argue, it's very hard to measure productivity in services. So in principle, there's nothing that prevents a different story where actually the development of services is driven, at least to some extent, not just by mere income effect, but also by productivity growth in the provision of those services or by a better organization, more rational organization of the society. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, we estimate at a granular level productivity growth in services, trying to use economic theory where data are hard. So in particular, trying to, we don't have good data on prices of services at the local level, and even if we have them at some aggregate level, we are worried that those prices are difficult to interpret because they could reflect increasing cost, but also increasing quality. And so that's always a challenge when one thinks about services. And the second goal is to assess the effect of, so once we have established where and how productivity growth has taken place, especially in services, to study their welfare implication. And you will see that there are some interesting findings there. What are the main results as a matter of preview here? First of all, we argue that there has been a large productivity growth in services during the period we study, and this is especially remarkable in some non-tradable consumer services where one not necessarily expects exactly to find large productivity gains. Second, within India, this is a study that goes to the granular level to 400 Indian districts. There are very large spatial differences. So there are very large differences in level of productivity between urban and rural Indian districts, especially in services, and also large differences in productivity growth. That makes for the next statement that the welfare gains, India is a country that has been growing fast, like other nations. Pakistan has also been growing a bit less fast, but and of course I don't know if the findings would be the same. I would need the same type of data. But in the case of India, we can say that service-led growth has disproportionately benefits rich urban households. So somehow, when you think about the effect of growth, there is something. That policymakers may worry about, that this is actually very concentrated in a part of the population. The analysis will be based on a set of very stark assumptions, but in the paper today, I won't have really time to study all those. We will, for instance, we are going to assume that labor is immobile across districts, but then we have an extension where we show that the results are robust if we model labor mobility. We are going to we also analyze an economy where India is an open economy that can export some of the services like ICT call centers. So all these things will not be salient in the talk. But and of course, they can potentially be important, but we show somehow in the study that in the end, they don't change the results I'm going to present today. Okay, so this is outline of the rest of the talk. I'm gonna give you a theoretical framework, then I'm gonna talk about measurement and estimation and quantification of this welfare effect I mentioned. So this is the way we think of the production sector and the economy. So we have many regions. In fact, we have about 400 districts. Here, for simplicity, suppose there are 3 regions. And I'm going to think about 3 sectors of activity: agriculture, industry, which will also include part of the services, what I call producer services, so corporate service, if you like, and then consumer services. And the important assumption we make is that the goods industries, namely agriculture and manufacturing industry, are going to produce goods at the local level that are tradable. So we will have the standard trick of assuming that there are local varieties of these goods, so that prevent an unrealistic pattern of full specialization. But then, these different varieties are traded, and so region 1 will produce a certain type of agricultural good, region 2. These are going to be aggregated at a nationwide food level, and this is tradable across space. Instead, consumer services are provided locally. So restaurants have to be can only be accessed by going to that particular restaurant, which is in a particular location. And so this is the crucial distinction that we make. That in every region there are a bunch of tradable goods. They're subject to some trade costs in moving them around, but then there are also some goods where the trade costs are arbitrarily large, so they are not tradable. And these are the 3 sectors of the economy. So if you think about region R that produces some non-tradable goods for local consumers, well, this good, which is what people consume, will have a certain content of tradable food, of tradable industrial goods, F and G respectively, and the input of local services. So if you think about, more or less local services are sold, but essentially, even if you buy rice in the market, there is some value added that comes from the person selling that rice in the market. If you go to a restaurant, that is, of course, even larger. So we are going to assume this type of Cobb-Douglas aggregation, although the results are robust to more general formulations. And I just want to note here that the price of this good will depend typically on the prices of the tradable good that could include some transportation costs, and then on the provision of the local services that will depend by the local wages and by the productivity of the service provision in a certain region. Now here, when you try to map this to the data, there's a lot of problem. We may not be able to observe all these local prices. We have to estimate these input-output matrix links. But especially, it's hard to tell what the productivity of services at the local level is. And that's what we are working on. And just to make the assumption, the model a bit more concrete, suppose that there are several such goods. And examples would be restaurant meal, cell phone, rice in the market. So when you buy a restaurant meal, you buy some food, the ingredients, you buy some goods, plates, kitchen equipment. And then the productivity of the consumer services is important in the quality of the service, for instance. And you have some people providing those services, like the cooks and the waiters. When you think about the cell phone, well, there's not much food there, but there are also the other elements. And when you think about rice in the market, well, the food component is bigger. So that's reflected in differences in these parameters, lambda. Okay, so how do we go about this measurement problem, and particularly the fact that it's hard to get a measure of this local productivity in services? We do it with the aid of a structural model, and we leverage information, micro-level information on 3 variables that for India is readily available through the NSS, which is collected every year. So we have information on the expenditure share on good and value-added aggregates. So we're going to calculate every person, how much that person spends on goods, on food, on consumer services. We have information about the sectoral employment in each district, and then we have information about the living standard of different districts. So let me give you an idea of how this identification works without entering the gory detail of the math. Okay, so first of all, we think that to understand this, we need to take seriously the presence of large income effect, because different consumers are going to consume different type of goods, and we see it in the data. But let me start from the simplest model, where preferences are homothetic, which is what we often assume in macroeconomics, and what we don't assume here. So if we were to accept that preferences are homothetic, and we could know what type of parameterization of preferences we are, well, suppose that we want to infer the change in the price of consumer services at the local level, and we don't have that information. But suppose that we have information about the expenditure shares. That's an easier one to measure. But suppose that we see this happening in Delhi. So we observe that the expenditure share of consumer services has gone up between 1987 and 2011. Now, using the theoretically implied relationship between expenditure share and prices, which can go, by the way, downward or upward sloping, it depends on what preferences you postulate. But that would allow you to retrieve from the from the expenditure share to retrieve the change in prices. So in particular, if this is downward sloping, you would conclude that there has been a fall in the prices of consumer services, because that would be consistent with this theoretical relationship. So you don't know the prices, you know the expenditure share, you see an increase in expenditure share of consumer services, you conclude that there has been a fall in the prices. Now, I want to say there is one case in which you cannot do that. If you postulate Cobb-Douglas preferences, because expenditure shares are constant, then you cannot identify the prices by this method. So it's a non-generic case in which you cannot use it. So we have to assume that we are not in a Cobb-Douglas world if we want to reason like this. Okay, so but that's a case in which there are no income effects. So the preferences are more precisely the case in which preferences are homothetic. But in reality, changes in the level of income can also affect the expenditure share. So suppose that consumer services are a luxury. And suppose that there has been increase in income. So that per se could explain a chunk of that increase in the expenditure share on consumer services. So suppose that we could measure that income elasticity. Well, in this example, we would conclude that there still be a fall in the price of consumer services, but smaller than under homothetic preferences. Again, as long as we know the extent of this income effect. In fact, if we think that the income elasticity is higher, then we could even reverse qualitatively the implication. So if we know there is a large income effect and there has been a significant increase in income, the observation of the shares would lead us to conclude that the price of consumer services actually increased. Note from what you can read here on the side that the knowledge of the true price of consumer services, together with the knowledge of the local average wage, which is something that is relatively easy to get, would give us a measure of the productivity. So that's why it's so important for us to have a good measure of prices. Okay, so now the question is, how do we know the strength of this income effect, and how do we know how important it is, these angle curves are, so how much the expenditure share depends on income. Well, we need to make some assumptions, some functional form assumption, and then we can estimate that. What class of preferences could we choose between? There are actually two classes of preferences that admit aggregation. We need aggregation here because otherwise we cannot do any of the welfare analysis we do. So we could use because there are, in the recent literature, some classes of non-homostatic preferences do not admit aggregation, so we cannot use those. But there are at least two classes that do admit aggregation. One is Stone-Geary, and one is the class of preferences represented called by PIDE, price-independent general linear preferences. And I'm going to use those preferences. First, I want to say that, well, Stone-Geary preferences that have been popular somehow in the literature have properties that fit very poorly the data. So we actually started from those, and it was we were going nowhere when we tried to do it quantitatively. So we're going to use instead this class of preferences called PIDE. This class of preferences have as the following feature. So you cannot write an explicit utility function that represents that, but you can write an indirect utility function that represents that. So instead of start from utility function that is defined on the consumption good, you have to start from an indirect utility function that is defined on income and prices. Now, rather than taking you through the properties of these preferences, I give you something that is very intuitive. So if you use Roy identity, you can go from this indirect utility function to a representation of the expenditure share. So you have a representation of the expenditure share that captures this type of preferences that are absolutely well defined. And this is the class of preferences, which is, a particular case of PIDE that we use in this study. Stare at this expression. Theta is the expenditure share on good n. It's a function of income and on the vector of price of all good at the regional level. And, it is a constant plus this term kappa n times something that is like a notion of real income to the power of minus epsilon. So the best is the picture. So if you look at the picture, let's say first first, what about if Kn is equal to 0? Then we have a Cobb-Douglas. The expenditure share is constant, like in Cobb-Douglas preferences. If Kn is negative, then we have a luxury. Well, because it's e to the power of minus epsilon, then you have a minus outside. So essentially, you have that at low level of income, you spend little on that good, and a high level of income you spend more, and then there is an asymptote, and this asymptote. So this economy in the long run looks like a Cobb-Douglas, and the opposite is true for a necessity. And then the elasticity to which the expenditure share converges to this asymptotic level is actually constant. It's this minus epsilon term, and it has to be the same for all categories of good. So that's the restriction that this class of preferences imply. I will show you that we can actually estimate that parameter. Okay, so this is the type of implication that we have from this representation of preferences. If you take the difference between the log of expenditure share minus the asymptotic share, suppose we know that, well, that is a constant minus epsilon, the log of the expenditure. And we can estimate that using microdata. So we can look at every individual, how much the expenditure is related to the level of income. That's how we do it. So, for instance, if food is so this can be done at the level of every individual final consumption goods, but that's going to be very complicated because there are many such goods. But then we show that you can actually aggregate up this, first of all, to the value added to the industry category. So you can generate, you can go from individual goods to value added aggregates, and you can run a similar type of relationship between the expenditure shares on food and income. So expenditure food typically is a necessity. Our analysis, empirical analysis, obviously confirms that. And so we have this type of angle curve relationship as something that we can estimate, again, using microdata. And so now we can do that on food, on industrial goods, and on services. It turns out, the data show that consumer services are a luxury. So the richer a household, the more the consumer service content they spend. The other thing that this class of preference allows us to do is to go from the individual level to the aggregate regional level. So we can, so we have one such relationship for every individual, but it turns out, and here is where the aggregation property is important, that we can transform that in an implication about the expenditure share, the average expenditure share at the district level, and the average income at the district level. In fact, there is a well-defined relationship between the fundamental parameters at the individual level and the same parameters at the district level. So we can then run regressions. We will still use all the individual data to estimate the epsilon, but then in order to inform the model and get the welfare effect, we're going to go at the district level. Okay, so that's the beauty of this class of preferences, and intuitively it's quite simple. It's just we have some goods are necessities, some are luxury, and here I can tell you the consumer services will be luxury, food will be a necessity, and manufacturing good will almost be aesthetic. Okay, so that's the class of preferences we use. Let me give you a flavor of how we actually go through the estimation process. I'm going to show you an expression that look a little ugly, but I will just take you through the intuition for them. So essentially, this is a trade model, and we have a set of local market clearing conditions for the different type of aggregates. So first, for consumer services, the demand for consumer services at the local level has to equal to the income that these generate, and we know how many workers work in that industry and how much they are paid. So that we have one such relationship in each district, and then we have a set of market clearing conditions also for tradable goods. If we didn't have trade costs, there would be just one at the national Indian level. In reality, because we have trade costs, we have to figure out what's the demand for each local good is. But essentially, we use a set of market clearing conditions to do what I'll tell you in a moment. And then we have a labor market clearing condition. So as I said, in the baseline model, we assume that there is no cross-district labor mobility, and so the labor force in a certain location is what it is. But again, that's something that we extend in the study. Okay, so this looks like a large set of conditions. You have one local market clearing condition for consumer services per district, and then we have the same. We have one market clearing for tradable good for each of the good producing sector and district. It turns out that this has a very nice identification structure. How? Well, first of all, there are three types of quantities in those relationships. The first is a set of items that we can measure. So we can measure expenditure. We can measure the distribution of productivity or ability, because we relate that to the educational level in a particular functional form way. That's what is called Q. I haven't talked about that, but just that you know. And then we have the average wage at a local level, and that we infer by looking at the average consumption, real consumption at the local level. So essentially, we have a bunch of observable there. Then we have a set of parameters. So those parameters can actually be estimated outside of the model. So it will be too long to take you through how we deal with each of those parameters, but I will spend some time on the angular elasticity epsilon. The angular elasticity epsilon that represents the strength of the income effect that I discussed before. So think that I have resolved the issue of how to measure all those set of parameters, which is what we do. So now I know a bunch of things that are data, and then I know a bunch of parameters by estimation of those. Now I can given the observable and the parameters, now I can retrieve the entire distribution of unobserved productivities at the local level in each sector. So I have a productivity in consumer services in each district. I have a productivity of manufacturing in each district and one of agriculture in each district. That's the output of this. So once I have those observable and those parameters, it's a one-on-one identification. So it's exact identification, which is, common strategy that people use these days in trade. Okay, so now I have reconstructed for 1 year the entire geography of productivities at the sectoral level for India. Of course, I can do it for other countries too. And I'm going to do that for 1987 and then for 2011. And that will tell me both the spatial distribution and also how the growth has evolved in how productivity has grown in different locations. There will be an exercise that will be especially interesting, which is given the estimated productivities in 2011, suppose that we were forcing the productivities to go back to the level they were in 1987, then we can measure the welfare effect on different citizens in the economy. Okay, so we can measure 1987, 2001 separately, and then we can say, okay, let's take the 2011 economy. We can associate each individual with a certain level of welfare, but now let's take back the productivity or subset of them to the level of 1987. How much would people lose in that case? And that's going to be our measure of welfare change. Okay, let me not dwell on this. Okay, so what data do we use? Well, we use the National Sample Survey for 2 years. That's a micro survey that probably people here know well. And we use the employment schedule. We also use the survey on the household expenditure and some information about the productive units. One task is one of retrieving all of these parameters. It turns out that some of them actually are implied by some type of normalization. Some of them are externally calibrated. Let me, for the sake of this presentation, only discuss the so-called angle elasticity, because that is what determines the strength of the income effect. And it's very important for the outcome of this estimation. How do we do that? Well, take a good N, and then you can write the expression that comes from the Pigel preferences. And then, as I was saying before, we can have a specification that relates the log of the expenditure to the log of income of each individual. Then there are some characteristics that are in the district, and that includes the prices. So prices may be different across district, but we assume are the same for all people in the same district. And then we have another bunch of control variables to make sure that we don't get things out of spurious correlation. Now, if you just plot this relationship, this is for food items. Well, the theoretical relationship would require that this is a straight line. You see, it's a little bit concave, which, strictly speaking, is not what our model requires. But it's quite good, I would say, the linear approximation of this curve. And just by running that regression, and we do it OLS, we also use an instrumental variable strategy, especially to caution for measurement error. The result is very stable. So the estimate is between minus 0.32 and minus 0.39. So this is using food, but we can also use service categories. If you do service categories, you see the results are very similar. If we pool services and food, again, it's pretty good. So remember, an important assumption for us is that the elasticity has to be the same for different categories. It turns out that the data help us on this. The data say, well, it's actually it could be that it gives us very different estimation, that would be a problem because it would be a rejection of our specification. So now we have learned what this income elasticity is. That's very powerful for us because then we can say, well, how much of the change in demand can be attributed to income effect, and then use the residual to estimate changes in productivity. Okay, so what are the results? Well, first of all, you can see, so what I'm plotting here is 2011. It's the log of productivity in consumer services across district. These are not all the districts. It's a bin scatter plot, if I remember correctly. So it's like aggregating similar district. But what you can see is that the productivity of consumer services in more urban locations on the right is much higher than in rural districts. It's not. There's nothing here that comes by construction. So in principle, we could have got the opposite picture. It would have been puzzling, perhaps, but there's nothing that makes it look so upward sloping, because in more urban locations, there are more people working in the consumer service sector, but people are also richer. So it could be that it's entirely driven by income effect. It turns out that it is not. How can we know? Well, because we know the strength of the income effect. So if it was all due to the income effect, it would look different. So already, this is an interesting picture. The other picture is, well, let's compare 1987, 2011, and look at the average annual growth of productivity. Where do we observe the highest annual growth of productivity? Remember, here we have never used published prices for that. So we are going to use what the model tells us about the prices should be, not published prices. And you see, consumer services annual growth is the highest among the three categories. So more than manufacturing and much more than agriculture. So there is a lot of heterogeneity across space. Productivity growth in consumer services grows especially fast in urban location, but on average, it's the most dynamic sector of the economy. That's already against the view that, well, this must be entirely driven by an income effect. The income effect have already been taken care of here, and yet there is a large productivity growth. Now you could say, well, perhaps it's just your model that spits out this. It turns out that if instead of using our model, we did it in a more traditional way, and we just look at the published prices, the results would not be identical, but it would be not terribly different. So we have productivity growth by categories, and we went to measure with the published statistics. The productivity growth would have been actually similar in consumer services. What we disagree is how it is relative to manufacturing. So in the traditional accounting way, manufacturing productivity growth is higher, and also agriculture is higher than we do. And of course, we wouldn't be able to tell the geography of this. And we somehow think that that way is not the right way to do it, but it's reassuring that we don't get 10 times the effect that we will get in the other way. Okay, so this is estimation. Then we show that the model fits a variety of moments in the data that we do not target. I won't have time to tell you about this, but the paper goes over those. And then I want to spend the last part of my presentation in discussing the welfare effects. So remember, now we have learned a number for the productivity, the total factor productivity. Well, here it's only one factor because it's only labor, but it's number for each of the three sectors in each district. So it's 3 times the number of districts of India. Those are this is the output we have at hand. How do we turn this in welfare effect? We don't care about growth, we care about welfare. Well, that's the advantage of having a well-defined structure of preferences that satisfies aggregation property. We can somehow go to the data and ask the following hypothetical question. By what percentage should we change, typically decrease, the individual's income in 2011 to make them indifferent between status quo and the situation where CS productivity, where consumer services productivity had not grown since 1987? Okay, so note that we can do this for every individual in India. So now that we have the productivities, We can ask this for every individual conditional on the income level that this person has. And so we can say, well, for this person, growth was very consequential. For this person, it was less consequential. And also questions like, well, for which person productivity growth in consumer services was consequential, and for which person productivity growth in agriculture was consequential. So we can transform this type of counterfactual into an evaluation of the welfare effect. And we can also turn that in consumption equivalent units, if you like so. So we can this is in income equivalent units anyway. Okay, so let me show you. Let me do the exercise in the way that I think is most intuitive. I'm going to compare two districts in India. One is a rural district in West Bengal called Bankura, and the other is the city of Bangalore, which is one of the most dynamic cities in India. And okay, so what do we see here? Here we see when it says welfare loss, you should think of welfare gain. So this is how much income you would be willing to sacrifice in 2011 to avoid to go back to the state of productivity of 1987. So when it says minus 0.25, it means that the growth in particular, this is a growth in consumer services. The growth in consumer services has been worth 25% of the income. Okay, so if we look at Bankura, sorry, I have said something wrong. This is the growth altogether of all productivities, not just in consumer services. So in Bankura, you see that the line, there is a downward sloping line. It means that the rich people have actually gained more than the poor people. So for the rich people, going back to 1987 would imply a setback by 25% of the income. For the poor people, it would imply a setback of the order of 7%. Okay. You can see also on the vertical the median income in Bankura. So there are very few people who have are far to the right. Now let's look at Bangalore. So Bangalore has a much more significant welfare gain, and the reason is that in Bangalore consumer service productivity grew much more. So going back to 1987 is a much bigger shock for Bangalore than it is for Bankura. And you also see that within Bangalore, if you are poor or if you are rich, it makes a difference because it makes an effect between 50 and 75%. So, the people who gain the most from this service-led growth are people in cities and high-income people. Why is that? Well, because preferences are non-homothetic, so rich people consume more of the consumer services, which are the most important source of growth for India. Moreover, the growth in consumer services productivity has been much higher in Bangalore. In fact, you can see below, in Bangalore, the growth was, the annual growth has been of the order of 10.8%, whereas in Bankura was just 2.4%. So you see that there is both a spatial difference in terms of welfare gains, and also there is an income difference. So those who gain the least are poor people who live in rural areas. Okay, so these are just two districts because I think that it renders the exercise in a cleaner way. But we can also present it in a different way. So this is how growth in consumer services, in agriculture and in industry, in productivity, has impacted the welfare of people at different percentiles of the income distribution. So here it's not conditioning on location. So most of these very rich people live in Delhi or in Bangalore, not in Bankura. And you see for these people, what it says welfare loss, again, you should think of welfare gain of the associated of the growth during this period, it is an order of 40% of the income, which is more than double the gain of the poorer people. So, so this is just the, sorry, I should have said that. This is just the effect of productivity growth in consumer services. So productivity growth in consumer services produces very large gain for people at the 90 to 99 percentile of the income distribution, so 40%. But for the people 10 or 25, there's not much of an effect. It's a 15, 18%. So those people have not benefited much for the increase in the productivity in consumer services. Instead of doing it by income distribution percentile, you can do it by urbanization quantiles. And the picture is similar. It's mostly the people in the most urbanized quintile of the distribution of district that gain. So, of course, the rich people typically live there also. But here I'm separating the two effects. And you see that most of the gain from productivity growth in consumer services accrue to people living in cities and high-income earners. What about agriculture? Well, agriculture is the opposite. Agriculture is the opposite. If you think about the very rich people and people living in urban districts, they don't care much about productivity growth in agriculture. Yes, they get a little lower prices in the food, but that's not a big item in their consumption basket. So those who gain the most from productivity growth in agriculture are the poor people. You see on the left, 25 to 30% gain is associated with productivity growth in agriculture, whereas for the very rich, it's 15%. And the same is true in urbanization quintile. Industrial good, well, it's a little bit like consumer services, but less extreme. So again, for the poor people, the ability of buying consumer buying the typical item at a higher price is the most important one. Okay, so when you aggregate this at a national level, that's what you get, but it's also, it shows you how much you lose, because it looks like both consumer services and agriculture matter a lot for welfare gains, about the same, but as I told you, for very different people. So the gain that come from agriculture are gains from poor people living in rural area. The gain coming from consumer services is mostly rich people in urban areas. Okay, so that's actually the last picture I want to show you before getting to the conclusion. So another question that we can address is the following. Given our model, how much of the structural transformation of India is associated with sorry, I have a question. Should I take the question or? Okay.
You first conclude, then we'll take the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So again, think of the same type of counterfactual. Suppose that we didn't have the growth in productivity in consumer services we have observed. Suppose that we didn't have the productivity growth in agriculture we have observed. Well, how would the Indian economy look in terms of composition of employment across sector? So if you look at this graph, the red bar is data. So during the period we are considering, employment in agriculture went down by 17 percentage points, and employment in consumer services went up by 14, and employment in industry went up by 3, approximately. And so what if we hadn't had any productivity growth in consumer services? That's what the yellow bar tells you. The yellow bar tells you that we would have had a very different picture for India. So we would have had much less decline in employment in agriculture, so much less urbanization. We would have had significantly less employment in consumer services and also less employment in industry. In contrast, the third bar, which is the effect of agriculture, you see productivity growth in agriculture has had very little effect on structural change. because locations that were at a high productivity growth in agriculture became rich. So by way of the income effect, they would want to consume more consumer services, but also they became more attractive to do agriculture there. And also because the agriculture is tradable, more of the benefits of that productivity growth gets exported to other parts of India, whereas for consumer services they tend to remain local. Okay, I'm getting to the end. I don't know why it has here. Yeah, again, I already told you, and I won't cover this slide, but if you have questions about the open economy, I'll be happy to address them. We have a version of this model so this version of the model is open within India, but not doesn't have an open economy with the rest of the world. But we also have a version where this is the case. Conclusion: growth in the service sector, is it a cause or a consequence of growth? In our analysis, counter with somehow prior that some growth and development economists, including ourselves, might have had, it looks as if there was a very important role of productivity growth in consumer services. Now, the question, of course, is where does this come from? And we can discuss that. From the analysis, we can tell them. We can make some informed speculation on that. These effects were strongly skewed in favor of the rich and skewed also in favor of urban consumers. So service-led growth on the one hand was not necessarily such a bad omen, because there is a suggestion here that it can actually continue to sustain growth of developing countries. Interestingly, I have done a similar exercise on China with much less data than I have in India. So this was just a preliminary exercise. And even in China, we start seeing a decline in the manufacturing sector, and the fact that productivity growth in consumer and producer services is quite important, at least in the last 10 years. China, of course, has overall a very different trajectory. So what questions are open? Well, first of all, what are the determinants of this productivity in consumer services? One possibility is just marketization. So people start doing for the market things that we're doing at home, and that brings about a significant improvement in efficiency. It could also be that there are some type of innovations. It could be that there is some entry of more efficient providers of services, like efficient supermarket chains, etc. How representative these patterns are for the developing world today, I gave you the macro picture, but I don't know if the same implication would hold true if I do the micro analysis. There may be implication of gender inequality during the structural transformation that we are studying in a separate work. And something we are really interested in is the effect of this process of moving to services on environmental sustainability. So we see that as economies become more service-oriented, there is a very large impact, positive impact in terms of reduction of emissions. That's something we are currently working.
And thank you, Professor, for enlightening us on a very important topic of this, how this transformation would have implications, especially for in the distribution of the labor force among different sectors, and also the benefit that we are getting from these transformations. Especially if we look into the India and in Pakistan, even in the Bangladesh, whenever there is a growth, there is always a question whether it is equally distributed among all sectors of the economy, or it will promote some sort of inequality that mean that giving benefit to the one class rather than the entire society. And very interesting, whenever we have a very high growth in Pakistan, especially I'm talking about the case of Pakistan, it always promotes some sort of inequality. So it means that the benefit of this high growth is not distributed equally among all sectors of the society. And your presentation would shed light on some of the key element within that context. So I will start with the question answer. Then I have a few questions, but let's take first question from Sadia Rana, then I'll get back to you. Sadia Rana, please go to it.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, it's a very detailed and the way you bring out comparative data and case studies in agriculture, consumer services, and industry is really impressive. Sir, I have three questions to ask. First is that does the generalization of preferences in consumer goods create further classes in every economy? And my second question is, how would you um, we conclude the capitalism philosophies that guide strategies for the export of services sector in an open economy? And my third question is that if we, as you talked about consumer preferences, and if we match it with freedom of choice, then in between, how we can incorporate the philosophies of capitalism in academia to bring structural changes, and how an economist adjusts this shift of structural changes in an economy. And a short one more question is, marketing affect the institutional original fact-based research? Does it?
Thank
You,
you
sir.
for your question. Over to Professor.
Yes, thank you. These are all great questions, and I will probably not be able to give full justice, but let me try to touch on them. So generalization of preferences, I wasn't sure if you refer to generalization of the preferences we use here, or if you thought generalization of preferences what we do relative to earlier studies. So let me try to touch on both. Yeah, so it's very important for us to have these non-homothetic preferences, because also in the in relationship with what Nasir was saying before, it's true that we observe some pattern of growth and inequality across time, across nations, but our analysis shows that there is actually more than it is in the data, because actually to the extent to which the economy grows in a certain way, even if you don't see income inequality, you may have welfare inequality. So that's one thing. Now, generalizing the preferences we have in terms of having a broader class of, for instance, PIDE preferences, we show that the results are quite robust for a range of perturbation. If you go very far, of course, things start changing, but also with some implications that are counterfactual. So I would say, at least in the class of PIDE preferences, the results are robust to generalization. The effect can become slightly larger or slightly smaller, depending in which direction you move. I cannot, unfortunately, answer when you think of more general preferences that do not admit aggregation, because then I lose actually the instrument for doing this quantification. What we find is that the type of restriction that these preferences imply are quite conform quite well with the data. Some people may take issues when they make very, very long time series studies that some preferences do better than PIDE, but those like Kumin, Lashkari, and co-authors have recently a paper. Those preferences cannot be used for this type of study, and I think that for the time range we use, this actually worked pretty well. Export of services. Actually, we are aware, of course, that is important, and so we do an extension in which we categorize some services as just produced for export. So some of the IT services, you take the extreme in which they are entirely exported, and then we also allow export of goods in an amount that is consistent with the data for India, and also the change between 1987 and 2011. And overall, this does not change the picture, I would say, because although this might have an overall effect on productivity that can be substantial, it doesn't really alter much the picture. So it's not such a large share of employment that go to these sectors, although the growth of these sectors is important, and they may be important for other reasons. So it doesn't seem, and we have a table where we show that it doesn't alter much the result. Well, philosophy of structural change. That's a philosophical question. I guess structural change is analyzed now often by economists, and the one question that I would, one reflection that this study has brought about is we would like to think of even the GDP of a nation as related to how much people are willing to pay for something. There is a kind of different tradition that comes mostly from, was in the socialist countries, for instance, in the Soviet economies. They not even counted most of their services as part of the GDP because they thought that this was just something that was actually, they didn't call GDP, they call net production. But anyway, so the notion of gross domestic product we want to think of is one where we don't question what people buy, and we just think of what people are willing to pay for what they buy. Now, there may be a question of the needs that are induced by marketing, for instance, as you mentioned, and other such things. And at the moment, we don't have much to add on that.
Well, Professor, an excellent talk. My quick questions which I would like to ask you for my better understanding, especially you have taken into account the density function when you talked about the income side, and that was actually clicking my mind that how do you incorporated that. But related to that, we talked about the homeopathetic preferences. Is it because that the services sector are primarily provided by the private sector, and essentially the government is not there? Because when we have service sector, which typically, like the case of Pakistan, is publicly provided without any marketability or pricing, then what would be the solution in terms of this sector leading the economic growth? This is my first question. Second is related to the distinction which you have mentioned about the non-tradability. What about the non-marketability of certain services? For example, related to the environment or other items which cannot be quantified or does not have some kind of a tangibility. Because in services, that's also one of the major parts. And lastly, what's your assumptions about the utility functions which you have used? Do they behave in the same fashion of concavity which generally we see for the consumption of goods? Do this behave in the same manner for the consumption of services, or do we have something which is otherwise we have a strictly positive growth rate, but not increasing at an increasing rate? But generally speaking, for the services, as you move up the ladder, the demand for higher levels of quality of services actually increases. So what kind of a utility function do you perceive when the individuals are consuming the services side or the quality perspective? So these are my quick thoughts, and in the next round, I have few more questions that come back. Thank you.
So I think I've good answer for your first and the third question, and less good for the second, because you touch upon an important point that we don't cover. So first of all, private versus public sector. This is something I should have probably mentioned. In this type of approach, we wouldn't know, without making some further assumption, how to deal with publicly provided sector like public administration, defense, etc. So essentially, what we do is we exclude those. Now you say, oh, this is crazy because it's a big chunk of it. Well, if you look at the employment share in this publicly provided sector, at least in India, it's flat. So nothing of the growth of the service sector is driven by these services. So while this is perhaps not perfect answer, and we should perhaps think about how to integrate these non-market provided services, I don't think that they played a crucial role in this period of the history of India in determining the shift towards services, because they were actually not growing, in some cases even slightly declining. Let me come to the third question, because yes, so this type of preferences does not admit a analytical representation of a standard utility function, but by having a representation of the indirect utility function that satisfies the standard properties and axioms, it means that it is a standard and legitimate representation of preferences. So, for instance, it would not violate the standard concavity. So, if you think about when, if you take an individual and that individual is actually given the income and given the prices, is given more consumer services to consume, well, then the marginal utility will be decreased. The important part here is that expenditure shares in homothetic preferences only depend on prices. But when you allow preferences to be non-homothetic, they also depend on income. So macroeconomists like me tend to use homothetic preferences because they are much more convenient, because you can define price indexes in an unambiguous way. Here, strictly speaking, even the definition of GDP is ambiguous because different people consume different baskets depending on their level of income. So you have to somehow strike some compromise. But microeconomists will tell you that the preferences are non-homothetic big time because we know that there are necessities, there are luxury, and the angle curves are a reality. So we acknowledge that, and although this type of preference does not have an analytical representation, other than that, it has actually standard property. The problem here is that once you start allowing for non-homothetic preferences and you want to have some type of aggregation, then you run very soon in problems with in analytical issues that this class of preferences has been shown to have this nice property I was talking about. I think that non-marketable goods is something really important, and I wish I had more to say. The only thing I can say is that we have a current project we are working in which we would like to think about quality in a more fundamental way, and I think that it's true that government expenditure in providing public goods and certain type of public goods and defense of the environment should be part of the next project, but we don't cover here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Related to Dr. Mahmood's question, so when we talk about the transformation shift, we already talk about the initial endowment, what kind of endowment they have. And if we look into the rural-urban divide, in the rural area, they primarily have a less opportunity to join the services sector, and the initial endowment that they have, especially in terms of human capital, that kind of endowment didn't allow them to actually switch from a more traditional mean of earning to a more sophisticated. But on the other hand, when we talk about the urban sector, their initial endowment, especially in terms of the skill set and the opportunities that are there, are relatively high. So that shift is a natural shift, or you say there is something else that probably compelled the urban sector to join more of the services part of the economy rather than, and that creates some sort of hindrance to the rural sector. One part of the question. The second part of the question is, what would be what I perceive from the model that you use, you take the government as a given in terms of, maybe I'm wrong, but I perceive that you take the government as a given. But in developing country, government have a very a massive role, either in terms of the government footprint where they are creating a business opportunities or economic opportunity. And the second, the role of government in terms of various intervention through controlling the mean of the business and the mean of the economic activity. So how you relate these two concepts while making these shift, whether it's a natural shift or is it a forced shift?
Once again, a better answer for the first and for the second. So the first is a very important point. So there is another view among some scholars in the structural change that says that, well, there are supply forces that triggers this change. So as people get more education, then the intensity of the demand of skills across different sectors differs. So you have the possibility of taking more people out of agriculture, right? Which is a plausible story. And for that reason, we have one extension in which we explicitly model the technology and the factor intensity as heterogeneous at the level of sectors and of district. And so instead of having perfect substitution, so in this model, we allow people to have different level of education, and that affects the number of effective units of labor that they carry. So some individuals will be richer and they have 10 times as unit of labor as someone who is poorer because it's less productive. That's the way it is in the model, in the baseline model. But then we have an extension in which there is explicit heterogeneity between high and low skill, which we can associate with education, and we allow this to vary across sectors in the economy. Again, this was an important endeavor because we had to estimate additional parameters, and we find that there is some evidence of skill bias technical change. That could be the other factor also that is important, but that in the end it does not alter significantly the picture I gave you. The second, right, I grant that government activity is really important. I have in the past worked in political economy, and I don't want to claim that we should look at the government. This paper was trying to provide some facts through the lens of structural model that has to do with has to be tractable, and at the same time provide some accounting exercise in a more sophisticated way than you would do by postulating a standard Cobb-Douglas production function. So it is in the vein of that literature that we call development accounting, but brings about like a richer picture. There is no direct role for the government, except that, of course, once we know and if we trust this result, the government could realize that there are more concerns, for instance, for inequality than one might have thought by looking at the aggregate statistics. So it indicates a path for possible intervention, but it doesn't introduce the government in the picture.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Dr. Khalid, from your question, then we will conclude this discussion.
Well, I come back to your comment which you have made about the basically your analysis has resulted into letting us know that since the services are actually not tradable, so that led to more growth as well. So it's a practically question of origin and destination, which in general for commodities is not an issue because they can be traded, they can be exported, they can be imported. But what we see around the world now is the influx of digital economy, where there is quite significant number of services which actually are produced, and they are the destination is virtually some other countries which are taking advantage of it. So would your analysis change in the future, let's say when we have more digitalized economy, part of services which are more than the current ones, then the outcomes would be different? This is one. The second quick question, which in terms of your understanding, does the age densities also matter for such types of analysis? Like, for example, in case of Pakistan, we have a bulge which is actually looking for jobs, and services are kindly the easiest and most policy oriented focused jobs like the IT and others. So does that really matter also in terms of profiling how the services sector is going to grow?
So, yeah, in my presentation, I had to cut some corners, but in reality, we have a distinction up front in the paper between tradable and non-tradable services that we also take to measurement. And we do by looking at the census of service of all firms of India, which is, I think, a data set, to my best of my knowledge, has not been used much. And so somehow we make a very careful mapping from the service industries and their tradability. And so some of these services, there are two levels, actually, to answer your question. The first is already in the closed economy context, part of the services and the IT services would be those, but also other corporate services would be actually included in the tradable industry because they are used as input. Initially, we even had a microfounded model that we were forced to take away for a reason of space. In the end, what we present is consistent with that microfoundation. But so there is really a distinction between what is tradable and what is not tradable, and we just look at the different service industry at the fine grid level, how much they sell to other firms and how much they sell to consumers locally. So that's what we try. That's what we do. Now, in the extension where we allow the export of services outside of India, there somehow we do it a little, we don't have, it's a little less refined, but I think we do it by excess rather than by defect. So we assume that all the IT services and specific subset of the corporate services are actually exported. We think that so we look at how much of that is in the data, and what we do it is somehow exaggerates how much is exportable relative to the reality. So we do take that into account, and of course, when we speak about services, we should always think about this consumer service aspect, and the fact that it's so salient. It could, for instance, when I do the analysis for China, I find that these producer services, the productivity of producer services, is very important. For India, initially, I also had a special category for producer services, in all what I showed you for. It just didn't look sufficiently prominent because, at least in these years, they were not such a big share of employment. And the fact that you say, well, will it always be like that? No, it's growing. So perhaps if I do the next time from 2011 to 2030, the importance of those activities, also for my analysis, will be higher. What was the other question you asked me? Sorry, I've lost track of your second question. Could you
Second
quickly?
question was related to the density functions, which are based on population, age, profiling.
No, I think there's some study that looks at this cohort effect, and we know that age is also important for the following reason. We don't have that many people that leave the farm and become urban workers, but we have many parents who used to work that work in the farm, and their children go to work as urban workers. So somehow this cohort effect is important. We don't really take this into account. I think it's in principle doable. So we have to make some reasonable assumption, looking also at the different education level. I have actually a student who is working on a related question and trying to look at the frictions for entering the formal sector, and how much these young people would have to go through a period in the informal sector. We don't do it in this study.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. In country like us, there are two key terms that we mainly concern. One is the sustainability of our growth, and the second is the equitable distribution of resources. So this divergence, would you see that there is any way to create a convergence, especially if we have to really promote the sustainable growth as well as the equitable distribution of the resources, from where the convergence would come?
I'm tempted to take in something else, but I will have to do it quickly because there is a project where I'm working with again with Michael Peters, but also with Philippe Aguillon and some other people, and we are looking at how changes in the expenditure pattern affect the sustainability and the transition towards services. How this affects the again, sustainability of the planet. And one point that we find, which may, be not so pleasant is that there is some sort of trade-off. So when you have a different pattern of consumption, the amount of emissions per unit of expenditure tend to be lower for richer people than for poorer people. So, and because, as you say, I think we should care about both objective, then we have to find a way to strike the right compromise between those forces. So there is like a force that induces probably not at a sufficient velocity, but somehow if you look at emissions in even a country like the US, it doesn't really put half as much attention as they should. It has gone down starting in 2008, but behind you have a lot of countries where people haven't had all those long periods option for using other type of technologies and also other pattern of consumption. So the question here is how are we going to deal with this tension? And I think that in an ideal world there should be a sufficient amount of transfer and compensation from rich to poor nations that I'm not too optimistic we will see on the table.
Thank you, Professor. Now over to Khaled for concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very enlightening. And to be very honest, after a very long time, we had a very rich paper presented here, because generally we have very topical kinds of discussions, but it was in blended favor of your knowledge as well as all the wisdom, economic wisdom, which we have understood. So hopefully we are looking forward for your future presence here in the form of presenting any of your interesting work, as well as PIDE is open for any collaboration. If you think if we can help you or sort of share our footings here for developing some co-theses, so then you're always welcome to engage with us, especially the macro policy lab is here doing same kinds of research as well. Thank you very much, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll certainly get back and see if there is something we can do. It was a great pleasure to be part of this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much.